By mid-morning, the heat was already pressing down on the Rourke Ranch like a heavy lid. Out here, in this stretch of West Texas, there's no shelter from it, only flat scrubland stretching into the horizon, broken by mesquite trees, dry washes, and the occasional windmill creaking in the distance. At 52, Daniel Dan Rourke was the kind of rancher who made this kind of work look easy. He'd been riding since childhood, taking cattle across the land long before there were GPS trackers or drones to help. That morning, July 17, 2014, he saddled up at dawn, loading a coil of rope, a canteen, and a small leather satchel. His goal was simple: drive a dozen head to the auction yard 30 miles east before the end of the next day. It was a trip he'd taken dozens of times. His wife, Elaine, handed him a coffee in a chipped white mug, kissed him on the cheek, and reminded him to stay hydrated. Dan just smiled and tipped his hat before nudging his horse into a slow trot toward the open range. The first hours were uneventful. The cattle moved steady, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that drifted behind them like faint smoke. By noon, the sun was a white coin overhead, and Dan took a short break by a windmill to water his horse. He sipped from his canteen, checked the cinch on his saddle, and looked out toward the distant ridgeline. He was a man who noticed things: changes in the wind, the movement of birds, the way the ground felt under his horse's hooves. If anything was bothering him, he didn't write it down, didn't tell anyone. In the early afternoon, a neighboring ranch hand spotted him about 5 miles from Dry Creek Canyon, moving at an easy pace with the cattle spread wide in front of him. That would be the last confirmed sighting. By evening, the cattle were seen again, this time near the entrance of the canyon. But Dan wasn't with them. No one could say exactly when they'd last been under his watch. A few of the cattle looked unsettled, their heads up, eyes wide, as if they'd been driven hard in the wrong direction before being left to wander. Elaine expected his evening check-in, a habit they'd kept since their first years running the ranch together. If the radio didn't work, he'd find a landline at one of the ranching posts along the route. But that evening came and went without a word. She told herself there was probably a delay, maybe a stray calf, maybe a flat tire if he'd loaded the cattle onto the trailer early. Still, she didn't sleep much, glancing at the dark window every time a pair of headlights passed on the distant highway. The next morning, she called the auction yard. No one there had seen him. His cattle had never arrived. That was when the unease shifted to something sharper. Dan wasn't a man who lost track of time, and he wasn't one to take unannounced detours. Elaine drove the route herself in her old pickup, scanning the fence lines, the dry gullies, and the dirt turnoffs. She stopped at the gas station in Fort Harlan, where the clerk shook his head. No, he hadn't seen Dan since last week. By the time she returned home, the heat had risen again, the sky a bleached and endless blue. She picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. Her voice was steady at first, explaining who her husband was, where he was supposed to be, but it broke when she got to the part about the cattle wandering alone. Within an hour, a deputy arrived to take a statement, asking the same questions she'd already turned over in her head. Did Dan have enemies? Had he been drinking? Was there trouble at the ranch? Each answer was the same: no. That afternoon, the first searchers were dispatched. They started at the canyon, fanning out across the scrub. The ground was baked hard in most places, making tracks faint and unreliable. The few prints they found could have belonged to anyone. The cattle were corralled and returned to the ranch, leaving only silence behind. Elaine stood at the fence, watching the dust settle in the distance, her hands gripping the top rail. She didn't cry in front of the deputies. She just kept her eyes on the horizon where she'd last seen her husband ride away, wondering how a man who knew every inch of this land could simply vanish into it. That night, as the searchers prepared to push deeper into the canyon at first light, the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. Somewhere out there in the darkness was the answer to what had happened between that last sighting in the open range and the cattle wandering alone near Dry Creek. No one knew it yet, but the path to finding Dan Rourke would not be straight, and it would lead into places that had been hidden for years. By dawn, the search had already begun. Sheriff's deputies set up a makeshift command post on the edge of Dry Creek Canyon, the air still cool but heavy with the knowledge that it wouldn't stay that way for long. A dozen volunteer ranchers showed up on horseback, men and women who'd worked alongside Dan or traded cattle with him over the years. They knew the land like the backs of their hands, and they knew how quickly it could swallow a person if something went wrong. Helicopters from the state police circled overhead, the thumping rotors carrying for miles across the empty scrub. Within the first hour, a deputy on horseback spotted something in the distance, a chestnut gelding grazing near a line of mesquite trees. It was Dan's horse. The animal's reins hung loose, and a length of rope dragged from the saddle horn, its frayed end coated in dust. There was no sign of Dan. The saddlebags were intact, but the small leather satchel he'd carried that morning was missing. The horse appeared calm, not lathered with sweat, which suggested it hadn't been running hard. It had simply been turned loose or had wandered off after being left behind. The searchers fanned out from there, following the faint impressions of hoofprints and boot tracks toward a dry wash that cut through the land like a scar. The prints indicated Dan had dismounted at some point, walking along the wash's edge. But just 100 yards in, the tracks stopped. The rocky ground offered nothing to hold a print, and without soft sand or mud, there was no way to tell which direction he'd gone. The deputies paused to take stock. No broken brush, no dropped gear, no obvious sign of a struggle. It was as if he'd stepped off the earth. By late morning, the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees. The heat shimmered off the pale rock, and the wind offered no relief. Searchers took turns checking low-lying areas where shade lingered, under overhangs in pockets of cottonwood near trickling springs, places where a man might rest if he were dehydrated or disoriented. But they found nothing. The canteens they carried grew lighter with every hour, and the horses began to slow under the weight of the heat. In the air, the helicopter crews scanned for anything that didn't belong, a glint of metal, the color of clothing against the scrub. One spotter radioed in about a dark shape near the mouth of a shallow cave, but when ground teams reached it, they found only an old sun-bleached tarp half buried in sand. The disappointment was palpable. Each false lead chipped away at the hope of finding Dan quickly. It was late in the afternoon when a neighboring rancher named Tom Harlan rode into the command post. He'd been checking his own property on the canyon's far side when, he said, he saw something that hadn't sat right with him. That morning, just after sunrise, he'd spotted 2 riders moving along the ridge above the canyon. They weren't from any of the nearby ranches. Their horses were unfamiliar, and they were driving a small group of cattle in a direction that didn't make sense. Tom hadn't thought much of it at the time, figuring they were passing through, but after hearing about Dan, he felt compelled to speak up. The deputies exchanged looks. The area was no stranger to cattle theft, but it had been years since anything serious had happened this close to town. The idea that Dan might have crossed paths with rustlers was unsettling and dangerous. If those riders had seen him, they might have tried to run him off, or worse. The sheriff ordered a few riders to head toward the ridge before dark, hoping to pick up fresh sign, but the land out there was unforgiving. Jagged rock, loose shale, and narrow drop-offs. The sun was dropping fast, and in the canyons, the light disappeared even faster. By the time the searchers returned, empty-handed and with horses stumbling from exhaustion, the only sound was the whine of wind through the creosote. That night, around the command post, the mood shifted. The first day had been fueled by urgency and confidence, but now there was a new edge, the creeping suspicion that this wasn't just a lost rancher. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of their lanterns, might be people who didn't want Dan found. And if that was true, the search was about to change. By the 3rd day, the search had moved beyond the frantic sweep of open ground and into a slower, more methodical effort. The urgency remained, but the sheriff's deputies knew the statistics were against them now. If Dan had gone down from heat stroke somewhere in the open, the odds of finding him alive were slipping away with each hour. In the heat of a West Texas summer, the desert could claim a body quickly and hide it even faster. But the facts weren't adding up neatly, and that was beginning to gnaw at everyone involved. At the morning briefing, the sheriff outlined the 3 theories now guiding the search. The first was the most straightforward: heat stroke. Even a seasoned rancher could misjudge his limits. Dehydration could lead to disorientation, and in that kind of heat, collapse could come suddenly. The second was foul play, a possibility that had gained traction after Tom Harlan's account of unfamiliar riders in the canyon. And then there was the third theory, the one some deputies were reluctant to say out loud, that Dan had chosen to disappear. It wasn't unheard of. Men in their 50s, worn down by debt, marriage trouble, or personal demons, sometimes walked away from their lives. But the people who knew Dan dismissed that instantly. Elaine was the most vocal, telling anyone who asked that Dan wouldn't have left her in the dark, not even for a day. They'd built their life together on the land, and she would have known if something had been wrong. Her certainty wasn't the desperate denial of someone clinging to hope. It was the matter-of-fact conviction of a woman who knew her husband's character better than anyone. That day, a pair of mounted searchers pushed further east, tracing faint impressions of cattle tracks that veered away from the main trail. The tracks led toward a rugged slope where the land began to rise, eventually connecting with an old mining trail long abandoned. The air out there smelled of dust and sage, and the only sound was the crunch of rock under hoof. The path, however, ended abruptly at a stretch where flash floods had torn the ground apart, leaving a jagged channel of dried mud and twisted brush. Any sign that might have been there was gone. It was as if the trail had been erased. Back at the command post, the deputies began speaking quietly among themselves about an old story, one that most had heard but few had given much weight to in recent years. Decades ago, rustlers were said to have used the remote canyons in this region to move stolen cattle across county lines without being seen. The terrain made it possible to keep a herd hidden from view, and the maze of washes and side canyons provided dozens of escape routes. No one had been caught using the method in years, but the story had never quite disappeared. The rumor fit too well with what little they knew. If Dan had crossed paths with rustlers, it could explain the missing satchel, the abandoned horse, and the absence of any signs of a struggle in open ground. But it was still just a theory. There was no proof, no names, no clear evidence linking anyone to his disappearance. Without that, the sheriff couldn't justify pulling more resources from other cases. By the end of the week, the helicopters were grounded, the mounted volunteers sent back to their ranches. A skeleton crew of deputies remained to follow up on tips, but the wide sweep of the scrubland was over. Elaine watched the searchers leave from her porch, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just told the sheriff one last time that her husband hadn't left on his own, and she wasn't about to stop looking just because the official search had ended. The sheriff didn't argue. In truth, he agreed with her, but without new leads, the trail was already cooling. And in West Texas, once it went cold, it could stay that way for a very long time. By late autumn, the search for Dan Rourke had faded from the front pages. The official investigation sat in a drawer, reduced to occasional tips that went nowhere. Most people in town had stopped expecting new developments, and for months the land around Dry Creek Canyon was left to its own silence. But in November, that silence broke. 2 bow hunters from out of county came into the sheriff's office with a story that, on the surface, sounded almost too strange to ignore. They'd been hunting mule deer along the upper rim of Dry Creek when they decided to follow a narrow game trail down toward the canyon floor. The day was still, the kind where even the wind seems to pause, when they heard a sound carry up from below, a sharp, metallic clanging. They said it came in short bursts, like something being struck against rock or steel. The noise echoed in a way that made it hard to pinpoint, but they followed it to an area near an abandoned prospector's cave, tucked into the canyon wall behind a spill of boulders. By the time they reached it, the sound had stopped. The hunters swore it hadn't been the creak of metal in the wind or the sound of falling rock. It was deliberate, like someone hitting metal on purpose. When they peered into the darkness of the cave, the air inside was stale and cold. A narrow tunnel branched inward, but a cave-in about 20 feet from the entrance blocked further passage. Uneasy and without proper lights, they backed out and made their way to the sheriff's office the next morning. Within days, deputies were on the scene. The Prospector's Cave was known to a few locals. It had been worked in the early 1900s for silver, abandoned after a series of collapses. The canyon around it was treacherous, hemmed in by sheer walls and loose rock. The entrance looked untouched, no recent signs of human disturbance. Inside, the floor was littered with rusted cans, splintered boards, and old lantern frames coated in decades of dust. The collapsed shaft was exactly as the hunters had described, with timbers rotted to the point of crumbling under a boot. A forensic team swept the site for any trace evidence, collecting soil and debris samples from the entrance and the cave floor. They didn't find clothing scraps, rope, or anything that could be linked directly to Dan. But near the base of the canyon wall, just a few yards from the cave mouth, they did find something small, a single boot print, faint but still defined in a patch of hardened mud. It was partially eroded, but the tread pattern was similar to the kind used on work boots common in the area. Investigators couldn't say with certainty it was Dan's, but the size and style matched. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Local papers ran headlines about a possible new clue, and within a week, the canyon saw an influx of amateur searchers. Some came with metal detectors, others with climbing gear, all convinced they could find what the deputies had missed. They combed the slopes and gullies, dropping down into side ravines and probing the edges of the cave-in. They found nothing of substance, but their presence kept the story alive, sparking new debates about what had happened that July morning. Theories flourished. Some believed Dan had been injured on the trail and had stumbled into the cave seeking shelter, only to be trapped by a collapse. Others leaned into darker possibilities, that he had been forced there, hidden intentionally. The location, remote and dangerous, fit too neatly into the idea of foul play. Privately, a few deputies admitted that if someone had wanted to conceal a man, this would have been the place to do it. The cave was invisible from the canyon rim, accessible only by a narrow approach, and its unstable structure discouraged anyone from exploring too far. Elaine visited the site once, standing at the base of the canyon wall while deputies worked inside. She didn't go in. She said the air there felt heavy, like the land itself was holding something back. When she left, she told the sheriff only that Dan wouldn't have come here on his own. Someone had brought him. Despite the renewed interest, the evidence still wasn't enough to push the case forward. The boot print was cataloged and stored with the rest of the file, another small piece of a puzzle that refused to take shape. The canyon returned to its quiet, but for those who'd been there, the place now carried a weight, a feeling that somewhere beyond that collapsed shaft, the rest of the story waited, sealed away in the dark. By the time the 4th anniversary of Dan Rourke's disappearance arrived, the case had become a fixture of quiet conversation in town, the kind that surfaced at the feed store, at the diner, or in line at the post office, then faded just as quickly when strangers came within earshot. The sheriff's office still kept the file on hand, but there hadn't been a meaningful lead in years. What had once been an active investigation was now little more than an occasional check-in when something suspicious came across a deputy's desk. In the years since that last sighting on the edge of Dry Creek Canyon, the land hadn't changed. The same wind cut across the same stretches of scrub, and the same jagged ridges caught the morning sun. But in nearby counties, there had been a string of arrests for livestock theft, crews working in the shadows, moving cattle along remote routes before the animals could be tagged or tracked. Each time one of those arrests made the news, people in town would wonder aloud if this was the missing piece, if one of those men had crossed paths with Dan in the canyon. But each time, the connection proved too thin, the evidence too distant. Elaine never stopped believing in the rustler theory. She didn't dwell on it in front of her son, but her eyes would harden whenever someone suggested Dan might have wandered off or staged his own disappearance. To her, that was an insult, not just to his character, but to the decades they'd built together. Dan was the kind of man who came home every night, who called when he couldn't. If something had kept him from doing that, it was because he couldn't, not because he wouldn't. Life on the ranch didn't allow for long stretches of grief. Elaine kept the place running with the help of her son, Matt, who had moved back home after college. Together, they worked the cattle, repaired fences, and made the long drives into town for supplies. The work was steady and unglamorous, but it kept them from sinking into the empty spaces Dan had left behind. She resisted every suggestion to sell, even when neighbors hinted it might be the practical choice. To Elaine, letting go of the ranch would have been the same as letting go of him. Inside the house, Dan's presence was still everywhere. His boots remained by the door, untouched since the week he vanished, the leather still carrying a thin dusting of the pale sand from that last ride. His hat hung on its peg, the brim curved just so from years of use. In the bedroom, his watch, the one he wore for work, was gone, but his old silver belt buckle rested on the dresser. Elaine kept those things in place, not as shrines, but as pieces of a life interrupted. Around town, the unease lingered. Ranchers who had known Dan since childhood would shake their heads when the subject came up. They all said the same thing. A man like him didn't just vanish without leaving a sign. Not in this country. Out here, skill and experience counted for everything, and Dan had both in abundance. If the land had taken him, there should have been something left to find. If people had taken him, well, someone should have talked by now. But no one had. Every July, Elaine marked the date quietly, riding out to the ridge where she had last seen him disappear into the horizon. She didn't bring flowers or say much, just sat in the saddle and let the silence settle. She'd stay there until the sun dropped low enough to throw the canyon into shadow, then turn for home. In the official record, his case was just another unsolved file. But in the minds of the people who'd lived alongside him, Dan's absence was still an open wound, one that would not close until someone, somewhere, told the truth about what happened that day in Dry Creek Canyon. And though no one knew it yet, the first thread of that truth was still out there, hidden in a place no one had dared to look deep enough. The summer of 2023 brought a drought that bit harder than most. Springs ran low, tanks dried to cracked mud, and even the shaded pockets of Dry Creek Canyon seemed to give up their green. It was in those parched months that two experienced spelunkers from El Paso decided to explore a section of the canyon that had been inaccessible for years. They weren't looking for anything connected to Dan Rourke. In fact, they barely knew the story. Their interest was in mapping old caves, particularly those damaged by historical collapses, before more of them were lost to time. The pair followed a narrow approach into a side canyon few people bothered with anymore. Loose shale shifted under their boots, and the heat seemed to pool in the still air. The cave they'd come for was partially hidden behind a jumble of boulders, its entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air dropped to a cooler, almost damp chill. A beam of light from one of their headlamps caught the glint of something wedged deep into a crevice along the left wall, just a flicker, almost overlooked. At first, they thought it was a bottle cap, the kind often found in old mining camps. But when one reached in, fingers brushing against rusted metal, he realized it was heavier, rounder. The object came free with a scrape, leaving flakes of corrosion in his palm. It was a wristwatch, the glass face long gone, its hands frozen at some unknowable hour. The leather strap had rotted away, leaving only the corroded case and buckle. On the back, beneath the pitting and discoloration, faint letters were still visible. DR. The spelunkers weren't sure what to make of it until a rancher they spoke to later mentioned the initials in the canyon in the same breath. Within days, the watch was in the custody of the sheriff's department, and the connection to Dan Rourke was confirmed by Elaine herself. She had given him that watch on their 10th anniversary, back when their son was just a boy. She remembered the inscription, remembered how Dan had worn it every day except when fixing fences in deep mud or breaking horses. The sheriff reopened the case immediately. This wasn't the kind of find that could be written off as coincidence. Forensic geologists were brought in to study the cave's sediment layers, trying to determine how long the watch had been there and whether it had been washed in by flooding or placed deliberately. The position in the crevice suggested it hadn't simply fallen from above. It was wedged as if pushed, perhaps by a person or by debris under pressure. News of the discovery spread quickly, reigniting public fascination with the case. Reporters came from Lubbock, Dallas, even Albuquerque, looking for the human interest angle. They interviewed Elaine on her porch, the dusty boots still by the door behind her. She spoke quietly, her words steady. If Dan's watch was in that cave, then Dan was in that cave. And if he was in that cave, someone put him there. Privately, investigators began trading old rumors again, whispers about an underground passage beneath the canyon that had once been used to move cattle unseen, part of a smuggling route that predated modern roads. No one had ever mapped it fully, and many believed it was just ranching folklore. But now, with a personal possession tied to a missing man turning up in one of those very caves, the theory felt more plausible. Elaine took the watch home after the forensic team finished photographing and cataloging it. She placed it on the mantel, above the cold fireplace, where the evening light caught the faint engraving. To her, it wasn't just a relic, it was proof. Proof that Dan hadn't simply vanished into the heat and emptiness of that July day. Proof that somewhere, in the dark veins of Dry Creek Canyon, the rest of the story was still waiting to be found. And for the first time in nearly a decade, the sheriff's department wasn't just chasing rumors, they had a tangible piece of Dan Rourke's last hours in their hands. Where that would lead was anyone's guess, but no one doubted now that the trail had just shifted from cold to burning hot. The renewed search effort turned the once quiet Dry Creek Canyon into the center of a coordinated operation. The sheriff's department brought in a specialized search and rescue team equipped with ground-penetrating radar, technology more often used in archaeological digs and disaster recovery than in rural police work. The cave where Dan's watch had been found became their starting point, but the focus was no longer just the visible chamber. They wanted to know what lay behind the rockfalls and hidden pockets that decades of erosion had sealed from view. The radar work was slow, each scan producing ghostly images of the subsurface voids and debris. On the third day, a technician spotted something unusual, a faint linear shape branching away from the main cave, running for nearly 30 yards before ending abruptly. The data hinted at an opening, perhaps no more than 3 feet wide, with denser material blocking the entrance. It didn't appear to be a natural collapse. The pattern looked too uniform, as if someone had deliberately packed the space with heavy rock and brush to hide it. Clearing it took the better part of 2 days. The work had to be done by hand. No machinery could be brought into the narrow, unstable entrance without risking a full collapse. Each stone was lifted, each tangle of roots pulled free, revealing a dark slit in the earth just large enough for a man to crawl through. The air that spilled out was stale and carried the faint, unmistakable odor of decay. The first team inside moved cautiously, their lights cutting thin beams through the dust. The passage sloped downward before widening into a cramped chamber. There, scattered across the uneven floor, were the pale, weathered bones of cattle, some still marked with the faint scoring of rope burns. In one corner lay the rusted frame of a flashlight, its glass lens shattered. A few feet away sat an empty revolver cylinder, the metal dulled by time but still intact. The weapon itself was nowhere to be found. To the sheriff, the chamber told a story even before the forensic teams could confirm it. This was a holding space, a place to stash stolen cattle where they couldn't be seen from the canyon rim or from the air. The bones, picked clean long ago, were likely from animals left too long in confinement or abandoned when they became a liability. It fit the old rustler stories perfectly, the ones locals had been telling for decades. But the presence of the broken flashlight and the revolver cylinder suggested something else. If Dan had been here, he hadn't come willingly. The fact that the passage had been sealed meant someone wanted this place forgotten, not just as a smuggling hideout, but as the scene of something worse. Excavation deeper into the passage was a tense and dangerous process. The supporting rock groaned under the slightest disturbance, and each new foot of progress had to be reinforced with temporary shoring. One wrong move could send tons of debris crashing down, entombing the team inside. For now, they stopped at the edge of another choke point, where the floor dipped sharply and loose gravel slid into darkness. Outside, the sheriff studied the recovered items under a shade tarp, his jaw tight. He didn't need to say what everyone was thinking. If Dan's watch had turned up in the other chamber, and this was the route that connected them, then they were closer than ever to finding out what happened in July 2014. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous the search would become. Elaine stood at the canyon's edge that evening, watching the lights flicker at the cave mouth as the team prepared for another day inside. For the first time in 9 years, she felt the trail wasn't just a collection of theories and rumors. It was here, under her feet, carved into the stone. And if they could clear the rest of that passage without it caving in, they might finally find the last place her husband ever stood. The reopening of the Chaos case had already stirred up old memories, but once the hidden passage was uncovered, the sheriff knew they needed to bring in fresh eyes, people who weren't burned out by 9 years of false starts and dead ends. Cold case detectives from the state capitol arrived in Dry Creek with a simple objective: find out who knew about that cave and who had a reason to keep it hidden. They began by pulling livestock theft records from every county within a 100-mile radius, focusing on the months before and after July 2014. Ranchers in West Texas kept their own mental ledgers of troublemakers, but the detectives wanted something more concrete: arrest reports, charge sheets, even grainy booking photos that might jog someone's memory. It didn't take long before a pattern emerged. The same names kept turning up in reports from scattered counties, attached to incidents where cattle went missing in small but profitable numbers. They weren't the large-scale, reckless rustlers of old. This crew worked in ones and twos, picking off a few head at a time and moving them quickly. The most troubling thing was their territory. Several of the thefts had taken place within a half-day's ride of Dry Creek Canyon. The crew was loose, not an organized gang, but a shifting circle of ranch hands, drifters, and small-time crooks. Of the 4 men most active in 2014, 2 were dead. One killed in an ATV rollover in 2017, the other shot in a bar fight outside Odessa the year after. The third had disappeared entirely, possibly in Mexico. That left one still alive: a man named Travis Gault. In 2014, Gault had been in his mid-30s, bouncing from job to job, never staying long enough to make friends or enemies. He was known for being hard to pin down, moving between counties and keeping his name off anything official. Still, the detectives managed to track him to a small town in southern New Mexico, living alone in a sun-faded trailer at the edge of a truck stop parking lot. When they knocked, Gault answered wearing a threadbare shirt and holding a coffee mug. He didn't act surprised to see them, only stepped back and gestured for them to come inside. The place smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and motor oil. They started easy, asking about his work, his time in West Texas, his connections to the other men in the crew. He admitted to knowing them. He admitted to working cattle in the Dry Creek area. And when they finally brought up July 17th, 2014, he didn't blink. "Yes," he said. "We ran into him that day." According to Gault, it was nothing more than a chance encounter. He claimed Dan was trailing cattle near the ridge and stopped to ask if they'd seen a stray. They talked briefly, then Dan rode off toward the east, alive and uninjured. When asked why he hadn't told investigators this before, Gault shrugged and said no one had come asking the right way. The detectives didn't believe him. His version was too clean, too convenient. They pressed him about why he and his crew were in that part of the canyon at all. Gault claimed they were just passing through, but offered no details. When they pointed out the history of theft in the area and the hidden chamber found in the cave system, he only said, "That's a dangerous place. Always has been." While Gault talked in New Mexico, the forensic team in Dry Creek was still combing the silt and debris near the concealed passage. The work was tedious, sifting inch by inch through dirt that had lain undisturbed for nearly a decade. Then, buried under a layer of fine dust, a technician pulled free a short length of rope, weathered, frayed at both ends, and stained with something that might have once been blood but had long since degraded. Hours later, another searcher turned up a cracked strip of leather with a corroded brass buckle. Elaine identified it without hesitation. It was from the strap of Dan's satchel, the one he'd been carrying when he left the ranch that morning in 2014. When the detectives presented findings to Gault, his expression shifted for the first time. He sat back in his chair, cigarette between his fingers, and stared at the table. "I told you we saw him," he said, his voice low. "Doesn't mean I know what happened after." It was a dodge, but the hesitation in his voice told its own story. The rope, the strap, the initials on the watch. Each piece by itself could be explained away, but together they were a chain. And that chain was tightening around the last man alive who'd been with Dan Rourke in Dry Creek Canyon. The question now was whether Galt would break before the cave walls did. The timeline of Dan Rourke's disappearance had always been a hazy blur. A hot July morning in 2014, a handful of cattle sightings, his horse found wandering alone, and then nothing. But after nearly a decade, with new forensic evidence in hand, and the last surviving witness finally in front of them, investigators could now begin to see the final hours in sharp, harrowing detail. It started, they believed, sometime after noon on July 17th. Dan had been spotted earlier that morning guiding his cattle toward the eastern route, a path that skirted the edge of Dry Creek Canyon. It was routine, one he had taken before. But that day, the cattle's trail showed a subtle drift south, toward the ridges and washes that fed into the canyon's less traveled reaches. Whether it was a stray calf or a shortcut in his mind, that detour put him directly in the path of a small rustler crew moving stolen livestock through the area. The cold case detectives now knew that crew included 2 men long dead and 1 man still breathing, Travis Galt. The rustlers had been using the canyon's concealed passage to pen stolen cattle out of sight before hauling them to auction far from prying eyes. If a respected local rancher like Dan saw them, their operation would collapse. It was too great a risk. Piecing together Galt's eventual confession with physical evidence from the cave system, investigators believe the confrontation happened fast. The rustlers rode up on him, armed and direct. Dan, unarmed and outnumbered, was ordered off his horse. His satchel was taken, along with any chance of using his radio. With his cattle already drifting and the sun dropping lower, they forced him toward the canyon wall where a narrow, brush-covered entrance waited, a man-sized slit in the rock leading into the hidden chamber. Inside, the chamber was stifling. The air was stale, the floor uneven. Rope fibers recovered years later showed he'd been bound, likely seated with his back to the wall while the rustlers worked outside. Galt admitted they left him there for hours, planning to move their herd under cover of darkness. What happened next was the turning point. According to Galt, sometime after midnight, Dan began working his way free. Maybe it was slow persistence, maybe desperation, but he slipped the ropes enough to stand. Galt had gone outside with one of the others to check on the cattle when a shout from inside the passage pulled them back. They returned to find Dan heading for the exit, the night wind at his back, his hat low against the dark. One of the others reacted instantly, raising a revolver and firing. The confined space amplified the shot, sending a metallic crack echoing down the shaft. The bullet struck Dan. Galt claimed he didn't know if it was the head or upper body, and he went down hard, the impact echoing against the stone. Panic set in. This wasn't just a theft anymore. It was something far worse. Galt admitted they dragged Dan deeper into the shaft, beyond the main chamber, into an unstable section they rarely used. They left him there, either dead or dying, with the loose gravel shifting under their boots. They knew that section could cave in at any time. It was part of why they'd never stored cattle there. The plan, Galt said, was to figure out what to do in the daylight once they'd gotten the herd moved, but daylight never gave them that chance. 2 days later, before they could return, a flash flood ripped through Dry Creek Canyon. Rain miles upstream funneled down the narrow washes, carrying walls of water, mud, and debris into the cave system. The side shaft where Dan had been left was one of the first to take the brunt. The rock there gave way, sealing the space with a dense plug of boulders, silt, and shattered timbers from old mining supports. The force was so great it wedged smaller stones into hairline cracks, locking them in place. When the rustlers came back, the passage was choked, and the air inside carried the heavy, unmoving stillness of a sealed grave. Galt claimed they tried to clear some of the rock, but quickly realized the danger. Every shift of debris sent smaller slides cascading down. In his words, "We figured nobody would ever find him. Safer to walk away." And that's exactly what they did, leaving the collapse as both barrier and tomb. Forensic geologists later confirmed the flood. Sediment cores from inside the hidden chamber matched debris layers from known flood events in that week of July 2014. Rope fibers found near the entrance matched those consistent with livestock handling, but the weathering suggested they had been exposed to both moisture and silt, just as they would have been if washed and buried during a flood. When Galt finally finished his account, the room was quiet. The detectives didn't need to ask him if he'd felt any remorse. His flat tone and fixed gaze at the tabletop said enough. This was survival for him, not confession. The sheriff carried the reconstructed timeline to Elaine himself. They sat at her kitchen table, the boot still by the door, the corroded watch now in a glass case on the mantel. He explained it piece by piece, how Dan had likely fought to escape, how he'd almost made it, and how the flood had sealed him in before anyone who cared about him could find him. Elaine listened without tears, her expression hardening as the picture became complete. "Then you know where to dig," she said at last. The team at Dry Creek now faced their final obstacle, an unstable shaft holding back nearly 10 years of silence and stone. The work would be slow, dangerous, and costly, but for the first time, they knew exactly what they were digging toward. And beneath that choke of rock and flood debris lay the man who had left home one hot July morning and never come back. The excavation began in the pale light before dawn, when the air in Dry Creek Canyon was still cool and the shadows clung to the rock walls. The sheriff's department had brought in a specialist recovery team, miners and structural engineers with experience in collapsed shafts, to finish what nearly a decade of searching had set in motion. The choke point sealing the unstable side chamber had been mapped in detail. Every loose rock, every timber fragment from the old mining supports was marked for removal in an exact order. The goal was simple: open the way without letting the entire shaft collapse and bury whatever lay beyond for good. Progress was painfully slow. The debris from the 2014 flash flood wasn't just mud and silt. It was a tightly interlocked wall of boulders, smaller stones, and roots, all compressed into something that felt more like cement than soil. A single wrong movement could release the weight above, and every worker knew that. They worked in 2-hour rotations, pausing between shifts to shore up the cleared space with bracing, their headlamps casting narrow cones of light into the dust. On the second day, a subtle change came. As they pulled a wedge-shaped boulder from the upper section, the air that slipped past was cooler, fresher. It wasn't the canyon breeze. It was the faint draft from a space that had been sealed for years. The team leader ordered everything to slow even further. Inch by inch, they cleared the last of the blockage until, just after noon on the third day, the first beam of light from a headlamp pierced into open darkness. The recovery specialists were the first to go in. They crawled through a narrow gap, the floor slick with fine gravel that shifted under their weight. Beyond the pinch point, the chamber widened slightly, enough to stand in with a stoop. And there, partially on its side, with one arm extended toward the direction of the collapse, was a human skeleton. The bones were arranged in a way that spoke volumes. The legs were bent as if the person had been dragged, not placed carefully. The extended arm reached toward the passage the team had just opened, frozen in the gesture of someone trying to get out. There were still traces of dark, compacted fabric around the rib cage, too degraded to be fully identified, but consistent with a work shirt. Near the skull lay 2 heavily corroded shell casings. The left side of the skull bore a deep fracture, a close-range gunshot that had grazed and penetrated the bone. The team paused, documenting everything in place. The sheriff stood at the entrance, silent, watching the forensic specialists brush the silt from the bones with small, deliberate strokes. No one spoke above a whisper. After so many years of searching and speculation, here was the truth, lying in the same airless dark where it had been left nearly a decade earlier. The remains were lifted with care, placed into a recovery stretcher, and carried back through the narrow crawl space. When they emerged into daylight, the contrast was jarring. The brightness of the canyon, the heat on skin, the sound of wind over the rocks. For the first time since that July day in 2014, Dan Rourke was above ground. The dental comparison was a formality. Everyone already knew. The records matched exactly. The fracture to the skull lined perfectly with the account Galt had finally given, and the location matched the map investigators had built from his statements and the physical layout of the cave system. The conclusion was inescapable. Dan had been shot during an attempted escape and left in an unstable section of the shaft, which had collapsed days later in the flash flood, sealing his body beyond reach. The final report classified the death as a homicide tied to a cattle rustling operation. The two men directly responsible for the shooting were dead, their graves quiet, long before the truth was uncovered. That left only Galt, who was charged as an accessory after the fact. The district attorney knew the charge would never satisfy the full sense of justice the case deserved, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was official. When Dan came home, it was in a plain pine box, the kind he would have approved of. A sheriff's escort drove the hearse up the long dirt road to the Rourke Ranch. Elaine had chosen the spot months earlier, under the wide spread of a cottonwood tree in the back pasture. Dan had planted it himself 20 years before, when their son was still a boy. The red earth turned soft under the August sun, the same earth he had worked his whole life. The funeral was small. Family stood alongside neighbors who had ridden in the search parties, ranchers who had known Dan since childhood, and the handful of deputies who had never let the case fade entirely into the cold. No long eulogies were given, just a few quiet words, a prayer, and the sound of shovels on earth. When the last of the soil was in place, Elaine laid her hand flat on the mound, her expression calm, her shoulders squared. She had asked for the truth for 9 years, and now she had it. Back in the house, she placed the one object that had come back from the canyon before he did in a glass case on the mantel, the wristwatch, cleaned of rust, its face restored, the engraving on the back polished until the letters shone. It wasn't just a reminder. It was proof that the darkness hadn't kept everything. Life on the ranch resumed in the slow, steady rhythm it always had. The wind rattled the gates. The cattle moved across the fields. The sun rose over the ridge and sank into the far horizon. But the question that had hung over the Rourke family, the one that had haunted every July since 2014, was gone. The canyon had finally given up its secret. For Elaine, it wasn't peace in the way people like to imagine, not the soft closing of a door. It was an ending, and endings are rare in a place like West Texas, where the land remembers everything and keeps most of it to itself. She could live with that. Dan was home, the truth was home, and the rest could stay buried where it belonged.